here to welcome you to the 1900 building, and I'm thrilled to tell you that in just a few months you'll be able to have dinner before or after the performance in the restaurant at 1900 upstairs. So, tonight, through the wonders of time travel, we are thrilled to present to you the 33rd President of the United States of America, Harry S. Truman.
I just tell the truth and they think it's hell. Good evening, my friends. It's wonderful to be with you tonight. And I want to begin by thanking the Carbank family for making it possible for us to get together tonight and talk about history. And I might add, in this beautiful building. My friends, in January of 1935, Mrs. Truman and I went to Washington, D.C. to serve in the United States Senate. And I said to her at the time, it was important for us to remember who we were, where we came from, and where we were going back to, and that's home and independence. Now, we served 10 years in the United States Senate, 82 days as Vice President, and then almost 8 years as President. And at the conclusion of that, General Eisenhower took over, and we did just that. We got on a train, and we came back to independence. Now, you know, one thing a president cannot do, he's not allowed to drive. So we got back, and I hadn't driven in a long time. And we decided we were going to go on a road trip. And there was no Secret Service protection in those days. Actually, we didn't have that for 10 years, and we loved not having it. We just resumed life naturally, like we had lived life prior to going to Washington. So we packed this was June of '53, and we packed our 1950 Chrysler, and we set out. And Mrs. Truman was saying, now, Harry, you're driving too fast. So we got as far as St. Charles, Missouri, and a young state trooper stopped us. And he said, sir, you were speeding, may I look at your driver's license? So I showed him the driver's license, and he said, oh my gosh, you're President Truman. He said, I won't give you a ticket. And Mrs. Truman said, give him the ticket. So, I got the ticket, and I said to the young man, I said, now, young man, that's your job, and you have to do it, so you do that. Now, we were on our way, and we were in Indianapolis, and we were had trouble with directions, and I asked a man on the way, we pulled over, and I asked him directions. We were going to visit some friends. And he gave them to me, and then he said, you know, has anyone ever told you you look just like Harry Truman? And he said, matter of fact, you sound like him. And I said, yes. And he said, must make you damn mad. Well, after being in Washington for 20 years, that didn't bother us at all. And we got quite a chuckle over that. Tonight I'm going to mention a few chapters in my life prior to the presidency, and then we'll talk a little bit about the presidency and, of course, the election in 1948 that no one thought I'd win, with the exception of Mrs. Truman, our daughter Margaret, yours truly, and Tallulah Bankhead. My friends, history is to a nation what memory is to the individual. If a nation forgets its history, it is disabled. The only thing new in the world is the history we have not read. And as director of the Smithsonian once said, if we do not have a historical perspective, we end up planting cut flowers. If we don't know what we did, Alexander Hamilton said, history has its eyes on us. I made decisions the only way I knew how. I did what I thought was right, and I based what I thought was right on my knowledge and appreciation of history. Didn't mean I didn't make mistakes. The only people who don't make mistakes are people who don't make decisions. I was born May 8th, 1884, in Lamar, Missouri. It was the Gilded Age, the age of steam, gingerbread Gothic, horse and buggy. Chester Arthur was president, and I lived to see rocket trips to the moon. Both my maternal and paternal grandparents came from Kentucky in the 1830s and 40s and settled in Jackson County, Missouri. It was the edge of the frontier, and they referred to it as the New Eden. We left Lamar about a year and a half after being there, came back to that family farm. So I do have some memories of Grandpa Young. He was a very successful farmer and a businessman. His farm was 1,200 acres. Very big farm. I think it was the third largest farm in Missouri. And he also had a freight business, over the land wagon train business earlier on. He went to Salt Lake City and Sacramento twice a year. So he's very successful. And I do have memories of him taking me to the fair in Belton, eating striped candy. He was a remarkable person. And so was my grandmother, Rebecca Young. Now, in 1890, my parents wanted my brother, Vivian, and my sister, Mary Jane, and I to receive a good education. So we moved to Independence, Missouri. My father was a livestock trader because they had a very good school system in Independence. And I liked being Harry Truman, and I liked growing up in Independence. You know, there's a lot of history there for being a young town. The Santa Fe Trail, the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, all started on the square in Independence. Now, growing up in the Truman household, we read a lot. We read Mark Twain, we read the classics, we read the Shakespeare plays. My mother loved Alexander Pope, so we read a lot of Pope. And I like Tennyson. In a little bit I'm going to read one of his poems to you. And we read the Bible. And I'll tell you that to some extent, I was predisposed to make the decision I did about Israel because of my love and knowledge of the Old Testament. And that came from childhood. Now, interestingly enough, until my mother died in 1947, at the age of 94, she subscribed to the Congressional Record. That way, we kept up with the debates that were going on in the Senate and the House. So you can see early on, there was an interest in government and politics for me. My father was a Grover Cleveland, William James Bryan Democrat. He was overseer of roads, he was a committeeman, so he was involved in Democratic politics. I remember in 1892, when Grover Cleveland won a second term in the White House, we marched in a torchlight parade through the streets of Independence. And by the way, Cleveland's the president that had 2 non-consecutive terms. He served a term, and there was Benjamin Harrison, the grandson of William Henry Harrison, and then Cleveland again. Cleveland's also the president that told us a public office is a public trust. My father and I found common ground on the sociability and the excitement of politics. Every year, we would hitch 2 of our best mules to a spring wagon, and we would fill it with fried chicken, cakes, and pies. And off we would go to Lone Jack, Missouri, to attend the Jackson County Democratic Picnic. And we would sit on that 1862 Lone Jack battlefield on blankets. There'd be about 2,000 people. And there would be congressmen and senators, occasionally a governor. And we would get excited about the speeches because that was entertainment back in those days for us kids. And there was a fellow. His name was Colonel Chris, and he was a colonel by agreement. And every 2 years, he ran for Congress in the Democratic Party, and he never won. But he was very famous for his oration of the Battle of Lone Jack, where we were sitting. And this one year, he was giving it, and a man stood up and said, "Well, now, Colonel Chris, I was in that battle, and what you just said never happened." And Colonel Chris said, "Wouldn't you know it? An eyewitness, he'll always ruin a good story." So, from a kid on, I was had lots of politics and history around me, and they were just wonderful days. My best friend in high school was Charlie Ross, and he would later become my press secretary. He went on to University of Missouri at Columbia, got a Pulitzer Prize in journalism. He was the smart kid in the class. He was valedictorian. And we would sit up night after night translating Cicero from Latin to English. We also spent about a month building a replica of one of Caesar's bridges that he built over the Rhine River. And I loved our teachers. I had a great history teacher. And of course, the greatest thing about attending school was we sat alphabetically. Maybe you remember the days when we sat alphabetically. And right behind me sat the love of my life, Bess Wallace. The most beautiful blue eyes and blonde curls you ever saw. And of course, I never had the courage to ask her out. But we became friends, and she was very good friends with my two cousins that happened to live across the street from 219 Delaware, and that came in handy later on. I wanted very much to attend college and earn a degree. But in about 1900, my father made some investments in some grain futures, and they plummeted, so the money was not there. Another great thing happened in 1900. My father was a friend of William T. Kemper, who was a Democratic National Committeeman. And we had the Democratic National Convention in Kansas City in 1900, and he gave me a job as an usher. So for a 16-year-old boy to walk in to that convention hall and see 17,000 people, it was really amazing. And saw William Jennings Bryan accept the nomination for a second time. Remember in 1896, he gave his famous Cross of Gold speech, "Do not crucify mankind on a cross of gold." That was 1896. Well, 1901, we graduated from high school. And I did apply at West Point, and I did very well in the exams, but because I was nearsighted, they didn't accept me. So we graduated, and I had to get a job. Now, my first job was at the Clinton Apothecary in Independence, when I was going to high school. After leaving high school, I moved to Kansas City, downtown Kansas City. First job was working for William Rockwell Nelson at the Kansas City Star. And I admired him. He was a progressive, and he didn't participate in yellow journalism the way William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer did. And he had a very successful paper. Third largest paper in the country, because it was subscribed all across the South, the West, and up into Iowa and Colorado. I worked there for about a year, and then I became a timekeeper for the Santa Fe Railroad. That's when I discovered something about minimum wage. Now, I didn't like the job, so I went to see Mr. Kemper down at 9th and Grand to see if I could get a job at the bank. And I worked there for 3 years as a bank clerk, and I liked it. And I ended up making $100 a month, and that was very good money back then. Interestingly enough, I became friends with one of the other bank clerks. We decided we would become roommates and save some money on the rent. His name was Arthur Eisenhower. Now, who would have thought in 1903 that I would become the 33rd president of these United States, and my roommate's brother General Eisenhower would succeed me in the presidency. My friends, we never know what life has in store for us, and that's an example. Also, that year was a good year because I saw my first president. And Mr. Kemper let Arthur and I go down to the train that was pulling into West Bottoms to see Theodore Roosevelt. And there was a lot of teeth to see, let me tell you. And of course, he was a character, TR. In 1905, my father asked me to become a partner with him on the family farm in Grandview. And I did. So I farmed for 11 years. During that period, I joined the National Guard. I also became a mason, and I loved working the land and making things grow. There was nothing more peaceful in this world than riding behind a mule plowing a field. Gives me time to think. My mother said it gave me my common sense. It taught me a great deal about hard work and patience. And it was during this period that I was reading a lot of Tennyson, and this poem just struck out at me, and I wrote it down. It's called Locksley Hall. Lord Alfred Tennyson wrote it in 1835, and it was published in 1842. I put it in my billfold. I recopied it for the rest of my life, and I'm going to read this to you. It deals with predicting civil aviation and military aviation. This is 1835, and also about a world organization. For I dipped into the future, far as human eye could see, saw the vision of the world and all the wonder that would be, saw the heavens fill with commerce, argosies of magic sails, pilots of the purple twilight, dropping down with costly veils. Heard the heavens fill with shouting, and there rained a ghastly dew from the nation's airy navies, grappling in the central blue. Far along the worldwide whisper of the south wind rushing warm, with the standards of the peoples plunging through the thunderstorm, till the war drum throbbed no longer, and the battle flags were furled. In the Parliament of Man, the Federation of the World. There the common sense of most shall hold a fretful realm of awe, and the kindly earth shall slumber, lapped in universal law. Now, when I went to Potsdam, Churchill and I talked about Tennyson's poem, and he said, Churchill called this the most wonderful of modern prophecies. But it had a great deal of meaning to me. In 1917, President Woodrow Wilson wanted to make the world safe for democracy, and I thought that was a good idea. So I joined up. I joined the Army. I'd been in the National Guard, and I went to Camp Doniphan, Fort Sill, and Lawton, Oklahoma. And that's where I met Eddie Jacobson. He was my first Jewish friend. We would remain friends for life, and we would go into business together, and also he played a little part in international affairs, and we'll come to that. We went overseas, and I was made captain of Battery D, 129th Field Artillery. I had about 175 young men under me. Most of them were from Rockhurst High School and Rockhurst College. I had to go to artillery school and fire school. And my friends, that was the most difficult thing I had done up to that point in my life. It was very hard work. Luckily, I was pretty good in mathematics. War was awful. Our big moment was the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, and it was horrible. When you kill someone for the first time, it never leaves you, and you never forget it. When those trenches fill up with water after a heavy rain, and the water turns red, you never forget it, it never leaves you. It made a man of me, and memories of war provided confidence and resolution in later life. And some decisions I made as president, I made from the experience of war. I was in Paris when Woodrow Wilson rode through the streets of Paris in an open carriage on his way to Versailles. Unfortunately, Wilson was he was very high-minded, not unfortunately, he was very high-minded. And he went to Versailles thinking that to the victors belong the toils. Well, Clemenceau, Orlando, and Lloyd George thought to the victors belong the spoils. And Clemenceau even said to Wilson, he had 14 points, the 14th point being the League of Nations. He said to him, Mr. President, what is this, your 14 points? God only has 10. So they were able to get Wilson to compromise on such issues as dividing up the Middle East, which had been called Arabia, and part of the Ottoman Empire, without any discretion or consideration about different religious sects or cultures. That was a big mistake. So it was hard. And every time Wilson objected to one of these things, there would become the League of Nations. Wilson thought that at least if we had a League of Nations, at the conclusion of the peace treaty and as time went on, we could settle all these issues in the League. Now, Wilson made a grave error. He did not include the opposition in the peace process, and that was a big mistake. Because Henry Cabot Lodge, in 1918, the Republicans got control of Congress. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge wasn't completely against the League at the outset, but because Wilson wouldn't include the Republicans in the peace process, that was a big mistake. And this is something that I had said a while back. A smart man learns from his own mistakes. A wise man learns from others' mistakes. So what we needed to do, which we did at the conclusion of World War II, President Roosevelt and our administration, we didn't make those mistakes. President Roosevelt made Arthur Vandenberg, senator from Michigan, chairman of the committee to go to San Francisco and write a charter for the United Nations. So we learned from those mistakes. Most importantly, we did not punish the people that we defeated. We did not charge them reparations. We did not take any land, and we helped them rebuild. And that made for a better world. So we learned from those mistakes. Well, now I had proposed twice to Bess Wallace, and it never worked. But right before I went overseas, Miss Bess Wallace accepted my third proposal. Now, I guess the courtship lasted 9 years. And that's a long courtship. But finally, in June 28, 1919, the happiest day of my life, Bess agreed to marry me, and we were married. Now, I had to make one major concession, and that was in order to marry Bess, I had agreed to live with her mother. And Mrs. Wallace, she didn't want Bess to marry me, so there was always kind of some difficult situations. Matter of fact, I can tell you a very funny story, because our daughter Margaret wrote this in her memoirs. One day after we became president, we were, Mrs. Wallace and Margaret and Bess, Margaret, and Mrs. Wallace were all sitting in the family quarters. And they were reading newspapers. And Mrs. Wallace said, Bess, do you remember so-and-so? She said, yes. She said, well, didn't you date him? And she said, yes. She said, he was just made vice president of the Commerce Bank. Just think, you could have been married to the vice president of the Commerce Bank. And they were sitting in the White House, in the private House. And you can read that in our daughter's book. But I take solace in someone that said, you know, behind every successful and good man, is a loving and caring wife, and a surprise mother-in-law. Now, when I came home, I certainly couldn't be a Missouri dirt farmer anymore. And Eddie and I had done so well in the regimental canteen in Oklahoma, we decided we'd go in business together. So we opened a haberdashery. It was in the Glennon Hotels where the Phillips Hotel is down on 12th Street. And we did very well for a while. And about 3 years we were very successful. And then we had the recession in 1921. I didn't blame it on Harding. Whenever there's a war, you have boom and bust, and that's what happened there. Now, I will mention Harding, though, because I am a lifelong Democrat. And I believe that our worst president was James Buchanan, our 15th president. He should have been impeached for interfering with the Dred Scott decision. I think our next worst president was Franklin Pierce. Then comes Harding. Harding had no business being president. And he actually said something that was remarkable, and we actually have a recording of it. And he actually said, in this job, it's not my enemies I'm worried about, it's my friends. And he was right. You have to be careful about that when you're president. You have to be very careful about that. We had the Teapot Dome scandals and many other scandals. And he died in the Palace Hotel in San Francisco in 1923. Had he not died and come back to Washington, that was all ready to break loose. But I certainly didn't blame him for the recession in 1920. Now, we went bankrupt, and it was necessary for me to get a job. Now, one of the young men that served in Battery D was a fellow by the name of Jim Pendergast. He was the nephew of Tom Pendergast. Tom had a brother, Michael, and that was his son. And they needed someone in 1922 to run for Eastern Judge of Jackson County. You may remember that in Missouri, the counties had an Eastern Judge, a presiding judge, and a Western judge. Now, I was out in the country, and I said, fine. The first time I met Tom Pendergast, he said the darndest thing to me. He said, Harry, there are three sides to every question in politics. Your side, my side, and the right side. And I said, well, Mr. Pendergast, I'm going to go for the right side. We were different people. He was a city boy. I was a country boy. He's a Roman Catholic. I was a Southern Baptist. I carried poetry in my billfold. Mr. Pendergast didn't. For the most part, he kind of stayed out of my way. And then in 1926, I ran for presiding judge. And of course, it had nothing to do with the judiciary. It was like a county executive, like we have today. And my job was to give out contracts, check to see how the county hospital was doing, and things of that nature. Now, in 1928, I'll give you an example of some of my independence from Mr. Pendergast. 1928, I proposed a bond issue to build the third best county road system in our country. And he said, Harry, most people voting in Jackson County live in Kansas City. They're not going to vote for that. The roads are out there. And I said, but Tom, roads go both ways. It would help people in both ways. Plus the real estate value increases with better roads. So at any rate, the bond issue passed. Now, I had to give that bid to somebody. Well, he, as you know, has a ready-mix concrete company, also a liquor distributing company, and he also gives out liquor permits. It's very handy to have all that going on. So I didn't give him the bid. I gave it to a company that did better work, and the cost was better. Well, I got a little Dutch, but I stuck to my guns. There was a moment in county government where I questioned what I was doing, whether it was the right thing. So I spent a weekend at the Pickwick Hotel. The hotel I usually went to was the Mulebach. It had been my hotel all my life. And I sat there for 2 days, questioning myself, because I was a witness to $10,000 being handled in the incorrect way. And I wrote all this out, and it's called the Pickwick Papers. You can read them at the Truman Library. But I decided I'd stay in county government, that the good outweighed, and I thought I was making a contribution. Now, in 1934, the fellow that was going to run, I wasn't able to run again for presiding judge. So they needed someone to run for the Senate. The candidate they had picked had died. Otherwise, I wouldn't have, again, it's just a question of being somewhere at the right time. And I made a terrible mistake, because I was at the Bothwell Hotel in Sedalia, and Jim Pendergast came and said, "We got to know right now." Well, I made a mistake of not asking Mrs. Truman. Did I get in Dutch? So I just said yes. I couldn't believe it, that I could be a member of the greatest deliberative body in the world. Remember, when we were a kid, we were reading all of those incredible debates. I read Henry Clay's speeches and Calhoun and Webster, and that was all part of my education. So to be a member of that organization was just unbelievable. My father died in 1914. Had he been living, there wouldn't have been a stopping him. He would have just been so happy and proud. And we did win that election. Now, I became a New Deal Democrat. So I was going to Congress. Roosevelt was elected in 1932. I want to read what Nathaniel Hawthorne says here. In this republic of ours, Hawthorne had written, amid the fluctuating waves of our social life, somebody is always at the drowning point. Now, between October 1929 and March 4th, 1933, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt took the oath of office, 100,000 people in the working force lost their jobs every week. It eventually came to between 20 and 25 million people. There were no safety nets. There was no such thing as unemployment compensation. There was no Social Security. None of that existed. There was no Securities and Exchange Commission to look over the stock market. There was no FDIC to look over the banks. When FDR became president, banks in 40 states had closed, and many people lost their life savings. Now, FDR was a remarkable person. At the age of 39, in 1921, he contracted infantile paralysis. The reason it was called infantile paralysis was because it attacked children. So it was very rare for a 39-year-old man to contract it. It was a virus that attacked the central nervous system. They knew nothing about it. We know it as polio. So he had to come from under that and then later run for governor and president. And he developed an empathy that was remarkable, primarily because of his physical condition. And he overcame it in the most remarkable way. He founded the Warm Springs Foundation. There was no other place in the country where polio victims could go to. That's why he's on the dime. He founded the March of Dimes with Eddie Cantor. And Eddie Cantor, the comedian, he used to say during the Depression, if a man walks into a hotel and asks for a room on the 12th floor, the clerk says, is that for sleeping or jumping? But it was true. FDR, we know FDR because of many things, and one thing we often hear about the fireside chats, where he used the radio in a way no one else had ever done. And his voice was magnificent. But you know, he only gave 12 fireside chats. Isn't that remarkable? And he was president for 12 years. So, excuse me, he gave 13 fireside chats. He would have been president for 16. And the first fireside chat was about the banking crisis. And he explained the banking crisis so well that the bankers understood it. And that was really doing something, because they didn't know. remarkable thing. So I became a New Deal Democrat. And one of the measures that I got behind so much was the Rural Electrification Act. 9 out of 10 farms in Missouri did not have electricity. And what bringing electricity to millions and millions of people was a wonderful thing. It provided jobs. All of these New Deal measures, the Civilian Conservation Corps, put between 2 and 3 million young men to work. They planted 2 billion trees and improved our National Forest Service. The Works Progress Administration, we rebuilt our infrastructure. We helped artists. Everybody in our society. Now, it didn't solve the problems completely, but we were making an effort to do something. Now, I used to imitate FDR and Mrs. Truman. As a matter of fact, all of us in Congress imitated FDR. He was too irresistible not to. But when he said in his inaugural speech, the first one, this nation needs direct, vigorous action. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Well, those words calmed a nation a little bit, because if you have tremendous problems to overcome, the last thing you need is to be fearful. And those words helped, and his words continued to help. And of course, he always said, my friends. I may forget to say this later, so I should say it now. When he died, there was a reporter standing right outside the White House when they carried FDR's casket out of the White House. And the man was weeping. And the reporter said, sir, did you know the president? And he said, oh no. He said, I never met the president, but he knew me. And millions of people felt that way. And a lot of people hated him, too. My opinion is that he saved capitalism. So I think he was a great president. So we continued to work with these New Deal measures, and it helped a great deal. We were on our way. And then, of course, 1936, a very kind and good man, Alf Landon, governor of this state, we're in Kansas, right? Yeah. Barely. Alf Landon ran, and you know, the poor guy, he only got 8 electoral votes. He didn't get Kansas. And he said a very funny thing, because there used to be a saying that every young schoolboy and girl knew, and that was, so goes Maine, so goes the country. Well, this time, Maine and Vermont only went to Alf Landon, so Alf Landon on election night said, so goes Maine, so goes Vermont. But he had, FDR had done so much, and so he was reelected in the largest landslide ever. I was happy being a United States Senator. One of the things that I relished about being in Washington was the fact that I was blocks away from the Library of Congress. And if you like history, that's a wonderful thing. So I was over there a lot. And when I became president, I used the Library of Congress quite a bit. Now, things weren't going too well back in this neck of the woods for Mr. Pendergast. And by 1939, he had been sentenced to Leavenworth for income tax evasion. And Tom probably would have been okay had he not gambled. But he was quite the gambler, and he never won, and he was using union pension funds and things like that, taking money out. And they didn't charge him for that. They charged him for not paying taxes on the money he stole. But he did go to Leavenworth, and he couldn't participate in politics anymore. So I was sort of tainted by the Pendergast name, because there's no question about it. If it wasn't for Tom Pendergast, I never would have been president of these United States. And to some extent, we weren't social friends, but he was good to me. I know he did bad things. The political machines were corrupt. And what we have to understand is the Kelly machine in Chicago, the Crump machine in Memphis, the Dickman machine in St. Louis, the Michael Curley machine in Boston, the Republican Vair machine in Philadelphia for 58 years. Every major city had a political machine. That's how things operated. And they did some good things. You know, the city, the county or city was divided in wards. There was a ward leader. Every so many blocks there was a committeeman. They were the first people to get telephones. So if you had a problem, you went to the committeeman. He called the ward leader. Next day, if you needed coal, then you got the coal. So that sort of was a safety net during the Depression. And you know, you might have, did you ever thought about this? What happened to those machines? All of a sudden they weren't here. Well, primarily because the New Deal took over their job. You know, we had Social Security and all these other things, and that's the kind of work that, that the machines did. So without the machines realizing at the time, especially in 32, 36, and 40, they were putting in the people that would eliminate their work. And that's kind of what happened. Post-World War II, we just didn't have those political machines anymore. But it didn't look good for me. I wanted to serve another 6 years in the Senate. And I entered the primary, and Lloyd C. Stark of Lloyd C. Stark Delicious Apples, he was the incumbent governor, was running against me. And that FDR, you know, Hoover said about FDR, he was a chameleon on plaid. Think about that. And sometimes he was. But he, behind my back, was supporting Lloyd C. Stark because he didn't think I could win, even though I'd been a New Deal supporter for 6 years. And that's how politics is sometimes. I tell the same thing to every person. I don't tell different things to different people. Well, at any rate, there were 3 people in the primary, and I ended up winning it by a few thousand votes, and then I was back in the Senate come 1941. Now, war was approaching, and what I realized at the end of World War I, there was so much fraud and scandal in contracts that were given to defense companies in World War I. So I wanted to get ahead of this. So I proposed to the President that we have a committee to investigate the National Defense Program. And I became chairman of that committee because it became known as the Truman Committee. And that's the thing that put me in prominence a little bit. Henry Luce put me on the cover of Time magazine. And I went all across this country and inspected the books in the defense plans. Because we were able to save during the war $15 billion, that's with a B, dollars, and the lives of many of our young people fighting because the machinery and the weapons they were using were being made correctly. Even Henry Luce of Time Life said that the Truman Committee was the first line of defense in America on the home front. So things were going well in the Senate. Of course, we entered World War II, December 7th. And in 1944, Henry Wallace was the sitting vice president. Now, I liked Henry Wallace. He ran with FDR in 1940. He had been Secretary of Agriculture for 8 years. He had never run for any political office. The rank and file of the Democratic Party didn't like Henry Wallace. He was odd. He spoke Chinese. He was interested in mysticism. So he just didn't get along with the rank and file. And he was very much to the left, which the Roosevelts liked. And I liked to some extent. But it didn't look like the labor and other segments of the party did not want Wallace. And there were a number of people in contention for the VP in 44. There was Jimmy Burns. Problem with him, he was a segregationist. There was Henry Wallace. There was William Douglas, the new young guy on the court. And there was Alvin Barkley. Now, there's one thing I forgot to mention. When I was running in the primary in Missouri, there was an issue that I had been trying to do something about in the Senate, and I could never get anything through committee. And that was, I felt our country needed a voting rights bill for all Americans and an anti-lynching bill. So I said this on the courthouse steps in Sedalia. And the people in the North kind of liked me for that. I said it because I believed it. I fought the Klan for 3 decades in Missouri. When I did become president, I desegregated the armed services, created the first civil rights commission, ended discrimination in federal hiring, these are by executive orders, and was the first president to address the NAACP, the National Advancement for Colored People, at the Lincoln Memorial. And I said to them, there is no justification for discrimination against race, color, origin, or creed, period. So that was my record on civil rights. And I did introduce, as president, a voting rights bill and an anti-lynching bill. And that was not, it didn't go anywhere. It took a few years later, and in Johnson, in 1964 and 1965. Now, I did not want to be vice president. And certainly Mrs. Truman didn't want to. And she said, my name had kind of been mentioned, and FDR, being the politician that he was, told every one of those other fellows that I just mentioned that they were his choice for vice president. So I assumed one of them would get it. And Eleanor Roosevelt was very much for Henry Wallace. Well, Mrs. Truman and Margaret and I got in our 1939 Chrysler, and we drove to Chicago for the convention. And I got a call from Jim Hannigan, who was chairman of the Democratic National Committee. He asked me to come over to the Blackstone Hotel, and I did. And when I went in, this apparently had been rehearsed. On the other end of he had the receiver up, and he said, and this is what he said, and this is what I heard. Do you have that stubborn mule from Missouri lined up yet? And Jim said no. Now, by the way, Jim was from St. Louis, so there's a connection there. He kind of switching names around on the list. History's an amazing thing. So he said, no, Mr. President, I don't. And then he said, you tell him if he wants to break up the Democratic Party in the middle of the war, that's his business, and he slammed the phone down. And I said, well, why didn't he tell me that to begin with? Now, I had to go back to the hotel, and the next day, I was nominated for Vice President of these United States. Probably things are different now, but at the conclusion of the convention, Mrs. Truman and Margaret and I just got in our car, drove back to Independence, all by ourselves. And interestingly enough, it was the longest drive of my life. 14 hours, Mrs. Truman said nothing. And it was about 2 or 3 weeks before she came around. And at one point, she came in the kitchen and said, your friend is on the phone. And it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So, I took the call, and he wanted me to come back and talk to him about the campaign, because he was a wartime president, and he wanted me to do all the legwork in the 44 campaign. I was astonished. I went over to the White House, and I hadn't seen Roosevelt up close, and there had been rumors about his health. So I went in, and we had lunch in the garden, and I was just astonished at his condition. And he was very thin. He was having difficulty concentrating on our conversation, and I read about this in my memoirs, and he was having a great deal of difficulty getting the cream to get into the coffee. He never maneuvered that. And I realized when I left there that day that if we were successful and beat Dewey and Bricker Tom Dewey, New York, Brooker, back to work quicker with Dewey and Brooker. That in fact, if we beat them, that I would become president. I knew that day. And this is in July of 44. I did not go home and tell Mrs. Truman. I did. And I eased into it. And during the campaign, there was talk and people were writing about Franklin Roosevelt's health. And so there were discussions about it. They didn't talk a lot about it. But in FDR, I think he made 4 campaign appearances during the 44 campaign. And he did an amazing thing. At one of those campaign appearances, he said, "These rumors that I've been hearing remind me of a friend of mine that lives north of Boston. He was going deaf, and he went down to Boston to visit an ear doctor. And the ear doctor asked him, did he drink a mite some? And he said, yes, doctor, I drink a mite some. The doctor said, well, if you don't want to lose your hearing, you have to stop drinking. And he said, you know, doctor, I like what I've been drinking so much better than what I've been hearing. I think I'll keep on getting deaf. So he kind of answered that issue of these rumors about his health. And it worked. You know, he was really an amazing politician. But we did win the election, and we were sworn in January 45, January 20th. And there was no Greek inauguration. We were at war. And the vice president, I was only vice president for 82 days. The vice president, according to the Constitution, presides over the United States Senate and votes in case of a tie. Well, on April 12, 1945, I was presiding over the Senate. And at the conclusion of the session, I decided I'd go down and visit the Speaker, Sam Rayburn. I went down there, and we were about ready to have a bourbon and branch, and Steve Early, President Roosevelt's press secretary, called me on the phone. And he asked me if I'd come quickly and quietly over to the White House. Now, I didn't think Roosevelt had died. I knew that he was in Warm Springs, Georgia, and there were other reasons I would go over there from time to time. So that wasn't on my mind, and I went in, and they took me up to the family quarters, and I walked in, and there was Mrs. Roosevelt and her daughter Anna and Steve Early. And she said, Harry, we have bad news. The president died today in Warm Springs. And I was stunned. And I regained my composure, and I said to her, I said, Ms. Roosevelt, is there anything I can do for you? And she said, Harry, she walked over to me, put her hand on my shoulder. She said, Harry, the question is there anything we can do for you? Because you're the one in trouble now. And she was right. And the next day I said I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me. And I was sworn in that evening in the cabinet room. The cabinet came, they were all in town. Chief Justice Harlan Fisk Stone swore me in. Margaret and Mrs. Truman, thank God, were there. And there was another woman in the room, and I like to talk about her because she was a remarkable woman, and that's Frances Perkins. When FDR, he appointed the first woman cabinet, and it was Frances Perkins, and he appointed her as Secretary of Labor. And she's the one that wrote the Social Security Act. She happened to be walking down a street in Brooklyn, or in New York that day in 1911, and she went by, she was walking by the Triangle Showcase Factory, and she witnessed 147 young women jump to their deaths. And she was already working in social work, and she made a pledge to herself that she would spend the rest of her life making working conditions better for women and men in our country, and she did that. So she had been Secretary of Labor from 33 up until when she left shortly after I was there for a while, but a great woman. I just want to mention her. My first decision as president was to go ahead and with the conference in San Francisco to create a United Nations. When FDR died in Warm Springs, he was writing the speech that he was going to deliver in San Francisco at the conference, which would create the UN. And the last words he wrote, he didn't speak them. His last words were, "I have a terrific headache." He had a cerebral hemorrhage. But the words that he wrote were, "The only limit to our realization of tomorrow will be our doubts of today." So I included that part of his speech in my speech. And right after I became president, I was thinking just about history. And I was thinking about some of my predecessors. And I was thinking about Lincoln. You know, Lincoln said something, and those words always stayed with me. And he said, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present." He was talking about slavery, but those words are relevant through all generations about all kinds of things. Lincoln also had another amazing quality. He had humor, and I will share this one story about him. John Hay was one of his secretaries and wrote everything down, every day. One day a man came in and he said, "Mr. President, did you know the Postmaster General died yesterday?" Lincoln said, "Yes." The man said, "May I take his place?" Lincoln said, "It's okay with me if it's okay with the undertaker." So it was important. It's important to remember to include humor. So I was looking at my predecessors for guidance. Theodore Sorensen said an interesting thing. He said that Lincoln was, is, and always will be the greatest presidential speechwriter of all time. And I agree with Theodore Sorensen. Theodore Sorensen was also funny. He was asked one time, and I was there, he was asked if he wrote or helped write John Kennedy's Profile in Courage, and his answer was, "Ask not." So humor is important. Now the first thing I did, of course, was to go to meet Churchill and Stalin at Potsdam, and I didn't know about the bomb for a couple of days. Secretary Stinson, he was Secretary of War, said to me that evening, "It's very important that I speak to you about a new weapon that we have developed." I didn't know anything about it. When I was chairman of the committee to investigate the national defense, I did see an appropriation for $3 billion that was not accounted for. So I knew something was up. But General Marshall and Stimson asked me not to look into that it was something very important and could win us the war. So they kind of brought me up to speed on it. So what it was harnessing the basic power of the universe to create this type of energy. Now when I went, and they were going to have a test in Los Alamos. So that hadn't happened yet when I went to Potsdam. And I met Churchill in Potsdam. I was on the world stage for the first time. This was all very, very new. And it went well. I realized at the end of the meeting that Stalin, at first I thought maybe we could talk, but it was pretty evident that at the conclusion of the war, the Soviet Union would be our new adversary. We hadn't come up for a word for it yet. And at Potsdam, I got the word that the test was successful, and I had to give the okay. Now, I had thought about this for quite a while. In 1939, Professor Einstein was at Princeton University, and he wrote FDR a letter telling him he knew for a fact that the Nazis were working on an atomic bomb. So had President Roosevelt not come up to the plate, can you imagine if the Nazis had gotten an atomic bomb before we did? We did not know how far along they were. So we immediately began working on it. And by the way, we worked on it with the Brits. This was a bilateral effort between the Brits and the United States to develop an atomic bomb. Now, Japan had never lost a war in history. In all of World War II, not one Japanese unit surrendered. All Japanese soldiers took an oath to the Bushido Code, which meant if you died fighting, you were not defeated. There was not a word in the Japanese lexicon for surrender. And so it wasn't part of their ethos. This was an adversary. The Nazis, the Germans knew when to surrender and how to surrender. This is an astonishing fact. Half of all casualties in the Pacific theater of war, starting with Pearl Harbor, occurred in the first 3 months of my presidency. That meant, as we were getting closer to the home islands of Japan, the fighting would be fiercer. They were turning planes into kamikazes, thousands of them. Okinawa and Iwo Jima were my two benchmarks. 50,000 American soldiers died in Okinawa in 4 days. Now, in all of World War II, we lost 650,000 people. Had we had an invasion, that number would have been increased. General Marshall thought we would lose another 250,000 Americans and probably 2 million Japanese. We were already killing with incendiary bombs all over Japan every night, 100,000 people, 80,000 people, day in and day out. That would all stop if the war ended. The other thing I had to ask myself is, let's suppose we didn't use it, and we did go to have a land invasion, and this happened. I would have to explain to the American people that we had the wherewithal to prevent the loss of an additional 300,000 young Americans. So I couldn't do it. So they're the reasons why I made that decision. It was the second most difficult decision in my presidency. So we used it. Hiroshima was the southern headquarters and depot of the home Japanese army. And the war did end. Peace had finally come, and we were back to some degree of normalcy. We developed a policy of containment. We would contain the Soviet Union during what Bernard Baruch coined the Cold War, policy of containment. And we did this whether it would be in Korea, Japan, or Europe, and including Berlin. We also came up with the Marshall Plan. We would help our enemies rebuild, getting back to what we had said about the end of World War I and the end of World War II. Now, in 1946, Republicans got control of Congress. I felt we were doing pretty well with our foreign policy decisions of containment. We passed the Truman Doctrine, which kept Greece and Turkey out of the influence of the Soviet Union as part of the containment policy. George Kennan, who was a career diplomat at our embassy in Moscow, came up with that policy through what was called the Long Telegram. These were very wise men. George Kennan, Dean Acheson, George Marshall. I said there wasn't a medal big enough for George Marshall. No question about it. We all know about the Marshall Plan. And by the way, Herbert Hoover was part of that decision. I noticed that he was in Washington one day, and I called him up and asked him if I sent a car over, would he come over to the White House. I liked Herbert Hoover. He didn't cause the Depression, and he worked on going to Europe, assessing the situation as he did after World War I for Woodrow Wilson, and then worked with the Marshall Plan. He later had him put in charge of the Hoover Commission, which totally reevaluated and changed the executive branch of government. So he was happy. He was back working. Now in '46, Republicans got control of Congress, and there was an expression in Washington that went like this: "To err is Truman." And my popularity just plummeted and plummeted. Of course, now I was very adamant about equal rights and introduced a voting rights bill. We couldn't get anywhere. I also, in 1947, introduced, in 1947, a national health insurance program. Well, that got nowhere. But in 1965, President Lyndon Johnson and Vice President Humphrey and other leaders of Congress came to the Truman Library and signed the Medicare bill out at the Truman Library and presented Mrs. Truman and I with the first 2 Medicare cards. And President Johnson visited me a number of times, and every time he came, he brought me a present. Twice, there were photographs of him, and once he brought me a bust. And if you go out and see my working office, you'll see that he positioned it on my desk where he wanted the bust to be. So you can see it, it's there. And I'll tell you a very funny story. When this was going on for the signing of the Medicare bill, I'd met Bill Moyers. He was President Johnson's press secretary and an ordained Baptist minister. But I liked Mr. Moyers. He was a young man, a very interesting, very intelligent fellow. And I said to him, I said, "Well, Mr. Moyers, what is it like working for Lyndon Johnson?" And he said, "Well, I'll tell you." He said, "Chancellor Ludwig Erhard of West Germany was down at the ranch about a month ago. And he said to Johnson, the Chancellor said, 'Mr. President, I understand you were born in a log cabin.' And Johnson said, 'Oh, Chancellor, you have me confused with Lincoln. I was born in a manger.'" And I said, "I understand." Now, Bill Moyers, he also told me this, that a little time after that they were having lunch, and Lyndon Johnson always wanted Bill Moyers to say the grace. So he said, "Bill, say the grace." So he started to say the grace, and Lyndon Johnson said, "Bill, I can't hear you." He said, "I wasn't talking to you." So he got his licks in. Now, I'm going to talk about the 48 election, but there were 2 foreign policy decisions that were very important to me, and one was Israel. Now, I told you I was predisposed to make that decision because of my love and knowledge of the Old Testament. I had been for a homeland for Israel as long as I could remember. I admired Chaim Weizmann, who was the leader of the Zionist movement going back to the 1880s and 90s. He also was a scientist. And this issue would come up from time to time. The British government had a declaration called the Balfour Declaration. This is right after World War I, when they were dividing up at the Versailles Peace Deal, we were dividing up with all the countries in the Middle East. And they recommended, at that time, a homeland for the Jewish people. I agreed with that. Now, the British changed their mind. The British had the mandate in Palestine. And you have to remember, the Jewish people were there 2,000 years ago. They never left. At the end of World War II, there were 450,000 Jewish people in Palestine. And we still had, after the Holocaust, there were still 250,000 Jewish people in prisoner of war camps in Europe with no place to go. 34 state legislatures passed, in our country, passed proclamations urging me to vote yes on the creation and recognition of a homeland for the Jewish people. And many governors wrote in letters. Now, my problem was with the State Department. There were a few people that were anti-Semitic in the State Department. Marshall was not. General Marshall, it's the only time we had a disagreement, and he was opposed to me recognizing Israel. And we had a final meeting on the subject. He said he would go along with, which they were proposing, that Palestine become a trusteeship of the United Nations and would be, and that would come sometime down the road. And I said that to delay this decision now, after 100 years of working for this, would be to deny it. And that's exactly what would have happened. So Marshall just said he was opposed to it, and some people sincerely were opposed to it because they said, look, you have 450,000 Jews and you have 25 million Arabs. How in the world could they possibly survive? And I said, well, you don't know the history of the Jewish people. If you did, you wouldn't say that. So Marshall said the other reason, of course, is oil. We would make enemies of all of the oil-producing countries. And I said, point blank, in a meeting with Marshall there and some other people from the State Department, that I was going to make this decision in the light of justice, not oil. And Marshall left, and I turned to everyone in the room, and I said, that was rough as cotton. And if you're a farmer, you know what I mean. Rough as cotton. But we had this disagreement. Well, Marshall, for some reason, came around, and he was going to resign as Secretary of State, and he came around to thinking this would work. Now, and it came down to literally the exact moment. And I gave a number of reasons, but I wanted to add this. In one of the reasons at the end of my talk about Israel, I said this: there must be a state haven for the Jewish people. Here is an opportunity to try to bring these ancient injustices to an end. The Jews could have their own homeland. They could be lifted to the status of other peoples who have their own country. And perhaps these steps would help atone in some small way for the atrocities so vast as to stupefy the human mind that occurred during the Holocaust. And that's how I felt, and I stuck to my guns. And Israel was created. Now, the very next day, Jordan and some of the Egypt and a couple other peoples invaded Israel, but they made it through, and eventually there was a trust. Now, I did say our position was partition, so that both the Arabs and the Jews would have a homeland, because Palestine was never a country. It was a conglomerate of other Arabs coming to that particular area, and it was owned by the Ottoman years. Before that, the Romans initially had it, and the Persians, and so this was an opportunity. And I did say that this would probably be a 75-year headache, but I stood by my decision. Now, 1948, and the Democrats, a lot of them didn't want me to run, as I said, to air S.Truman. And they wanted General Eisenhower to run. So I called up General Eisenhower. He was president of Columbia University. And I said, now, General, the Democrats want you to run, I'll step aside. You know, I did that, but I did. He said, well, Mr. President, in no way do I want to run for politics. And we didn't even know if he was a Democrat or a Republican. So he said no. And then I thought about it, and I thought I believed in our foreign policy decisions. I believed in our domestic issues. So I decided I would go to the convention, fight for the nomination, and I did that. I went to Philadelphia. Now, I insisted that there be a voting rights bill and an anti-lynching bill in the platform of the Democratic Party. Mayor Hubert Humphrey of Minneapolis stood up at that convention, and he said, in introducing these planks to put in that platform about civil rights, he said, it's time that the Democratic Party gets out of the arena of states' rights and gets into the arena of human rights. And that exploded. And Strom Thurmond, governor of South Carolina, they stormed out, and the Democrats, and they left the convention. And he was nominated by the Dixiecrat Party. And so here we were, a party split in half. But I came out. I didn't get to the podium. I was finally nominated. And I didn't get to the podium until 2 in the morning. It was prime time in Guam. And I said, Senator Barkley and I'll win this election and make those Republicans like it, and don't you forget it. And the Republicans say they're for education. They say they're for health care. Did it. Well, fine. I'm calling this 80th Congress back into session, and they can do everything they said they want to do and still have time to go out and run for office. Well, they didn't expect that. Now, the one thing I have to say about the Republican 80th Congress and the Republicans, period, and that is, we worked very well together on foreign policy, primarily because we included them in those decisions. They supported the Truman Doctrine. Roosevelt and I developed something new. It was called a bipartisan foreign policy. And this was good. And regardless how we felt about our domestic issues, and you know, there were many Republicans that were concerned about equal rights and civil rights more so than these Southern Democrats under Strom Thurmond. So we had a lot in common as well. But I was running against the do-nothing, good-for-nothing 80th Republican Congress. So we left that convention, and then Henry Wallace ran on a third ticket. Remember, he had been my predecessor as vice president, and now he was running as a progressive on the progressive ticket, getting a lot of support from the far left and the Communist Party, etc. And so how were we going to win this election? We didn't have a lot of money, and remember, people don't swim to a sinking ship. And we were kind of a sinking ship. So we got on the train. We made 3 major train trips, about 35,000 miles. We spoke to millions and millions of Americans, and I talked about the issues. Henry Wallace wasn't the only person that knew a little Chinese. I had a Chinese quote proverb that I use, was we were trying to get this education bill through. And I use this, and many of you may have heard of this. If your vision is 1 year, plant grain. If your vision is 10 years, plant trees. If your vision is 100 years, educate children. Now, that's a Chinese proverb, and I use that on the campaign trail. And the Truman administration was the first administration to come up with a school lunch program, because children have to have nutrition, and then they get education. They have to have nutrition first. We were doing pretty well. We were doing very well with crowds, but the Republicans said, well, it's just because people want to go see a president, that's all. He happens to be president. So they just want to see a president. California with Earl Warren. Now, when Earl Warren ran for governor of California, he got the nomination of the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, and the Progressive Party. He's a popular fellow, so things aren't looking good. We kept it up. Not one poll said we would win. Dr. Gallup with his Gallup poll, did not take the poll a week before the election. There was no need to. Dewey was going to be president. It was a clear-cut case, and that's the way it was. Claire Booth Luce, wife of Henry Luce, said, "Mr. Truman's time is short. His situation is hopeless. Frankly, he's a gone goose." Well, we finally got back to Washington, and then we went home to vote. And Mrs. Truman and Margaret went to Memorial Hall in Independence. We voted. I told Mrs. Truman and Margaret to go back to the house. I was going to go down to the Millbach Hotel. That's where our headquarters were. That's where we were when we were elected vice president in '44. Well, when I got down there, I'm telling you, it was very glum, very glum. People were very, oh boy, this is it. We're no chance of winning. And I stayed around for a while. And I called Margaret and Bess and said, "Go to bed. I'm going to go over to the Elms Hotel and get a good night's sleep." So a couple Secret Servicemen and I, we went over to the Excelsior Springs at the Elms Hotel. And I checked in. They didn't expect me, of course. And I got a steam, glass of buttermilk, a ham and cheese sandwich, went to bed. And long about 9 o'clock, I woke up and I tuned in National Broadcasting Company, and there was the clipped, authoritative voice of H.B. Keltenborn. And he said, "Well, the president is ahead," and I imitated him when I got back to Washington at a dinner. "The president is ahead by 1 million votes. But when the country vote comes in, he will assuredly be defeated in the greatest landslide for Tom Dewey this country has ever seen." So I said, "What the heck does he know about the country?" I farmed for 11 years, so I turned it off, went back to sleep. Well, about 2 o'clock in the morning, the Secret Service knocked on the door. It was too bad, but we got elected. And they woke me up, and we went back to the Mulebach, and then we went back to Independence. Now, poor Mayor Roger Sermon, they hadn't planned for any kind of victory celebration. So everyone's scrambling here to and fro. And by Wednesday afternoon, we didn't have any debt. And I referred to these people as Wednesday afternoon Democrats. We could have used that money, but it was okay. It all worked out. The people, it was a people's election, and they made the decision. And I told the people that my job was to be the lobbyist of 160 million Americans as president. And we had won the election, and it was on the way back to Washington, D.C. Our train pulled into St. Louis, and Colonel McCormick of the Chicago Tribune, he had printed the wrong headline. He didn't care for me at all. And a few of them got as far as St. Louis, and a lady handed me one of his papers, and I'm going to hand it to you. This is the real McCory. And she didn't hand me this one, but there it is. So I held this up, and everyone was very surprised. Well, we had a lot of work to do. We got back to Washington. We created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization because the will to peace must be backed by the strength for peace. And my most difficult decision as president was Korea. We did have a security treaty with South Korea and with Japan, and this was something different. It was the United Nations' first effort. The UN was working very well socially, economically, and politically, but it had not yet worked as a police force to stop aggression. And I had great hopes that this would be a possibility. So we were part of, and the bulk of that United Nations effort to stop aggression in Korea. Now, I did have problems with General MacArthur. He wanted to use atomic weapons on Chinese cities, and and put nuclear waste along the Yola River. And this was ridiculous. First of all, as soon as the Chinese troops came over the border, the Korean border, with Russian armaments, we were not going to get in World War III. I just wanted to get to the 38th parallel, and then eventually, after Eisenhower was in for 3 months, there was a truce. But one of the greatest things about our Constitution is that a civilian is in control of the military. And with with MacArthur, when I fired him, I said that General MacArthur is one of our greatest generals, but the welfare of our country and the peace of mankind is more important than any one individual. Now, there were a few people that I disliked in government. One was Senator Joe McCarthy. I said to him, Senator McCarthy, I have news for you. We're going to keep the Bill of Rights on the books. And in our country, we punish people for crimes they commit, not for opinions they have. I didn't like him. I didn't like the House Un-Americans Committee at the time, and this is where Nixon got his rise. I said that the most un-American thing about America at that time was the House Un-Americans Activities Committee. And the other fellow that I disliked was J. Edgar Hoover. Right after I became president, he came to the Oval Office with some dirt on people that didn't like me. And I said, now look here, Mr. Hoover, you're sitting in the Oval Office of the President of the United States. I don't operate this way. You take this stuff and get out of here and never come back with anything like that. I never saw him again for the rest of my presidency. We communicated by letter a few times and phone calls. And I actually tried to get him fired. But there's some things a president cannot do. It's a pickle sometimes. And I didn't like Nixon. I didn't like him from the beginning. Nixon was a bright guy. Now, I was alive when he was elected twice. And he did some good things. No question. Hubert Humphrey and I have been talking about recognizing China for many, many years. That was just plain stupid. And, but he was always opposed to, well, he got to be president, he did it, and that's a good thing he did. But Nixon had two character flaws that no president should have. And that is, he was insecure and he was a liar. And if you have those two character flaws, you're not going to be successful. And it's a shame, because he was a bright person. It was coming time. 52 was coming, and I attended a Jackson Jefferson dinner, and Mrs. Truman was sitting at the head table, and I announced that I would not. I signed the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution that limited a president to 2 terms. I thought that was a great idea, and I certainly, if I had run again, I would not have been elected. Plus, if I had run again, Mrs. Truman would have divorced me. So that's another reason not to run. But when I announced I would not run, I looked at Mrs. Truman, and the smile on her face was someone's face that just pulled 4 aces, playing poker, and got 4 aces. And speaking of poker, a lot of people, do you know what the buck stops here comes from? The buck stops here is a poker term. When you're playing poker, and I played poker all my life, Mrs. Truman played bridge, I played poker, she read mystery, and I read history. And that's why our daughter wrote mysteries in historical places. But back to poker. But we had a poker table, and in the middle of every poker table, if it's a real poker table, like yours, there's a buck buckhorn handle marker on that table. And if you decide you don't want to deal, you pick up that buckhorn handle marker, or you pick up the buck, it's abbreviated to the buck, and you pass the responsibility of appealing to the next person. In other words, when you're president, you can't pass the responsibility of things that you have responsibility for. And if you want to say something as president, you should say it. You shouldn't have someone else say it. You know? One of the most important things about being president is that you need a moral compass. It's very important. And I admired Adlai Stevenson. He ran in '52, and he ran against a great guy. I mean, it's nice to have the choice of two great people, I think, to run for all political office. But Adlai Stevenson, I admired his intellectual courage. He did not win, but he elevated the character of American political life. And he said something, he was very funny too. Not since Lincoln did we have that kind of language in our political lexicon. But he did say in his acceptance speech, which is remarkable, he was sort of like Washington, Plato's philosopher king, where the office sought the man. That's what Plato was writing about there. But he said the burdens of the office stagger the imagination. Its potential for good or evil now and in the years of our lives smothers exaltation and converts vanity to prayer. So he was talking about the good and evil within the presidency. So in 1974, we turned our TVs on and we saw the evil part. Nixon had to resign. So Stevenson was great. Stevenson was also funny. They asked him what it was like to be ambassador to UN, and he said, protocol, alcohol, Jericho. And in 1952, Norman Vincent Peale came out against him because he was divorced, and they asked him what he thought, and he hadn't heard it, and he said, well, why? And he had just heard it, and he said, well, right off the top of his head, he said, well, I find the Apostle Paul appealing and Norman Vincent Peale appalling. So he was funny and brilliant. He was brilliant and funny. It was wonderful to come home. We came home and there were 10,000 people to greet us in Independence at the train station. And for the first 4 years, every day I got in my 1950 Chrysler, and all by myself, I drove down, which is Truman Road now, to the Federal Reserve Building, where the government gave me 2 offices, and that's where I wrote my memoirs and began working on the Truman Library. Presidential libraries are built by private subscription, and when they're built, they're handed over to the National Archives. Presidential homes are part of the National Park Service. But it was wonderful. I met everyone going down there. We'd go to Bretton's for lunch or the Mulebach, and one day this man got on the elevator. He was so shocked to see me. He stepped on my foot, and he said, "Oh, Mr. President, I'm so sorry I stepped on your foot." And I said, "Oh, don't think about it. I do it every day." But it was good to be home and amongst friends. And when the library was built, I went there pretty much every day for 17 years and spoke to young people. And maybe 300,000 young people over a period of many, many years. I got to be friends to some extent with Thomas Hart Benton. I didn't like his artwork at all at first. I thought that it was very elongated. And a couple of things you may not know about me, but I took 11 years of classical piano training. And my teacher was a student at Paderewski. She grew up in Poland. And in 1903, she took me to one of his concerts here in Kansas City. And we went backstage, and Paderewski taught me to play his Minuet in F. I did very well with Chopin and Mozart. They were my favorite 2 composers. My favorite art was Renaissance art, which I read about all the time. And when I took Mrs. Truman to Europe in the 1950s, I asked when we got to Florence ahead of time if it would be possible to meet Bernard Behrens. And a reporter said, well, why do you want to meet Bernard Behrens? He was a Renaissance scholar, and I said best in his field. So we spent a whole afternoon with Bernard Behrens. And I liked American art up until after World War II. George Caleb Bingham was my favorite. And you know the fellow, some of you I noticed are from the Nelson Art Gallery. And in December 11th, 1933, Mrs. Truman and I were at the opening of the Nelson Art Gallery because I was there in an official role as presiding judge of Jackson County. So that was a wonderful thing to be there then. I had actually met William Rockwell Nelson a couple of times when I was working there at the Star. And then, in 1961, Mrs. Truman and I were honorary chair of the sesquicentennial for George Caleb Bingham's birth. He was born in 1811, because we loved Bingham's work. I grew up with Bingham's work. Order number 11 was a favorite of mine. So it was good to be home, and I remember that Senator Kennedy came to see me in 1960 to the Truman Library and asked me if I would support him for the Democratic nomination in Los Angeles. And I said, no, I couldn't do that. I was supporting Senator Simon. And he said a strange thing to me. He said, well, is it because I'm a Catholic? And I said, now, Senator, I worked hard and supported Al Smith for the presidency in 1928. Senator, it's not the Pope I'm worried about, it's the Papa. But I told him that if he got the nomination, that I definitely would crisscross this country for him, because I didn't want to see Nixon as president. And so it was wonderful to be back home. Now, I think I probably talked long enough, but I would like to ask you if you have any questions. Do we have a microphone? Okay, Matt's got a microphone. I would love to answer some questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand.
Larry, did you really memorize the eye chart to get in the National Guard?
Yeah, I did, because when at West Point I passed all the exams, but because they called it flat eyeballs in those days, but I was nearsighted, but a very bad case.
And when you were in war, how many pairs of glasses did you have to have?
I think I took 8 pairs of spectacles, of which the young guys got a big kick out.
Mr. President, I understand it was a failed assassination attempt against you?
That's correct. That's another thing I didn't mention. There's a million things I didn't mention. But when we got back from the campaign in '48, as 1949 came along, I began to realize that there was only 2 things holding up the White House, and that was paint and tradition. The place was falling apart. And there's the story about Margaret Truman's, about our daughter's piano legs falling through, and that did happen. So we just had to, it had to be completely gutted, but I oversaw, and I'm getting to the assassination, but this is part of it. I oversaw architecturally great, redoing the White House as it was. They had to come in with a bulldozer and dig a deeper foundation. And I was made absolutely clear that everything that could be salvaged and brought back in was, and it was. But in that time period, which was almost 4 years, the entire term that I was elected to myself, I lived at Blair House, which had been the official guest house for visiting head of state. Mrs. Truman was delighted with that. We didn't have as many social affairs, and that was fine with her. So one day, I was taking a nap, and this man yelled, and I heard him yelling, and traffic went along. The security wasn't as tight back then, and this man just yelled, "Harry Truman," and I went to the window, and then I pulled back. but two men came running up. They were Puerto Rican nationalists, and they tried to come into the building, and unfortunately, one Washington, D.C. policeman was killed, and one of the Puerto Rican nationalists was shot. And the thing that was weird about that was because there had just been a plebiscite in Puerto Rico. It was fine if Puerto Rico wanted to be its own country. I had no objections to that, but they had a vote and they chose to remain with the United States as a territory. So there's not much I could have done about it for these fellows. And but it wasn't. We were very sad about that. So there technically was an attempt on my life. Yes.
Would you describe your relationship with Churchill?
Well, you know, the thing, I actually got to know him a little better when he came to Fulton to deliver the Iron Curtain speech, and also when I visited him in England. When we went to Potsdam, you know, a lot of people don't understand the parliamentary form of government. Here's Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, and he harnessed the English language to successfully defeat the Nazis, and he single-handedly saves Britain, and then he's voted out of office. But they weren't voting for him. They're voting in a parliamentary system. You're voting for the party. Whichever party gets the most seats in the House of Commons, the leader of that party becomes the prime minister. Now, if they've been voting, and the issue wasn't survival in war, the issue then was labor. It was jobs. People were coming back from the war and they needed jobs. So they figured the Labor Party, Clement Attlee, would do better at that job. So when I got to Potsdam, Churchill was there, and then he had to leave because the election occurred while he was at Potsdam and he was no longer prime minister. So I really didn't get to know him too well, but we did, on the occasions we did meet. Westminster College offered him an honorary degree, and he came to Washington. Now, he was out of office. He then was his party, Conservative Party, was elected again in '51. But I did go with him on the train to Fulton, Missouri, to Westminster College, and was there for that speech. And you know, when you think about the Iron Curtain, as I said, in World War II, we lost 550,000 Americans. The Russians lost 25 million Russians. So even though we disagree with them and their system, that's why it's important to know history and know the history of your adversary. I mean, they had a little bit of a reason for being paranoid. Napoleon came and burned Moscow. Then you had the Germans come in World War I and the Russian Revolution, and then you had the Germans come again. Although they did sign a non-aggression pact with Hitler. That wasn't a very smart thing to do. But you know, you have to think about that, where people are coming from. And but Churchill, he was, you know, I think one of the interesting things about Churchill is he's the only head of state to ever receive the Nobel Prize for Literature, the history of the English-speaking people. And you don't often find that, you know. So, but Churchill, you know, we disagreed on empire. Roosevelt and Churchill disagreed on empire. He was an empire person. And that world was going away.
To what extent do you think your work on investigating excess war profits of the defense contractors led to your nomination?
Well, you're absolutely right. That put me on the cover of Time magazine. That made me, I was never a household word until I became vice president. But being chairman of that committee and the success, Steve, of that committee made me not only better known, but respected amongst my colleagues. In other words, I was no longer the senator from Pendergast. I was the chairman of the committee that saved us $15 billion in the lives of life. And here again, why did I do a good job with that committee? Because I was a county administrator. I gave out contracts. Working in Jackson County for 10 years, made it possible for me to do a good job. So one thing leads to another. But you're absolutely right.
Mr. Truman, what was the
Yes.
most difficult decision you had to take as a president?
The most difficult decision was Korea. Whenever you send young people to war, that's a very difficult decision. And I'm glad you mentioned it, because John Adams, our second president, said the most unforgivable sin for any president is to put our country in an unnecessary war. So when the Russians blockaded Berlin, we didn't talk about Berlin, when the Russians blockaded Berlin, there was, let's just go to war with Russia, let's get it over with. Well, no, you have to go down every avenue possible, hopefully diplomatic, and in this case, that didn't work. They blockaded. So Berlin is in East Germany. It's divided with a French sector, British sector, and American sector, and then West and East Berlin, which is the Russian sector. So they blockaded all entrances. These people were not getting food, fuel, medicine, whatever. And what we did, rather than to go to war, we came up with another idea, and that was brilliant, I believe. My advisors gave me good advice, and I didn't have any ego. I was happy to get advice from anybody, even if they were the striped pants boys. But we did an airlift, and at the height of and it went on for 11 months, and at the height of the airlift, a plane landed every 45 seconds. That was a very difficult thing to maneuver, but it said, again, you don't want to go to war unless it's absolutely necessary. So Korea was the most difficult. But there are a lot of difficult decisions when you're president, no question about it. I mean, I was the Labor president, and when we got back, after, when the war was over, John Llewellyn Lewis said, "You who supped at Labor's table, a curse be on your house." Because there were some things I was objecting to what Labor was doing with striking. And he knew his Shakespeare and his Bible, John Llewellyn Lewis. You remember him? Yes. The bushy eyebrows. I guess, thank you very much.